All right, so let's look at a graph here. And this graph represents the average price of a resold home in the United States, and it's indexed based on 1890's prices. So in 1890, the index begins at 100, and effectively anything above this mark is going to represent an increase in prices, and anything below it would represent a decrease in prices of a resold home. All right, so you can see that, throughout history, the price and the value of homes certainly declined at different times and rose at different times. So we have like these little gray areas. This is during World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, during the 1970s when there's a little bit of a real estate boom, and the 1980s real estate boom. But I want you to pay close attention to the 2000s, because at the tail end of the 1990s and the early 2000s, we see almost an irrational behavior in the market for homes. So our index goes from 110 to 200 by the mid 2000s. If we were to look at this mathematically, this would be around an 82% increase in price levels. So what cost $100,000 in the late 1990s cost $180,000 in the mid 2000s. Well, this is again kind of an irrational behavior that existed during the 2000s relative to the real estate market. And certainly it was a larger percentage increase in the price of the average home sold and resold in the United States in our U.S. history, or at least since 1890. So this boom in the real estate market was followed by a bust. And you can see that the home prices went from, then again, that high point all the way back down to levels seen right around before the boom. All right, so what do we call this behavior in a market that exists when the economy experiences this irrational increase in price levels? This is referred to as a bubble. And so we refer to this as what we call a speculative bubble. Okay, so let's look at the definition of a bubble and then some examples. A speculative bubble is whenever the price of any given asset rises above what the typical value of that asset is. It's typical for home prices to increase over the years, but is not typical for them to increase by nearly 100%. In South Florida, where I was living prior to moving to the Brunswick area, home prices were increasing in some areas by 200 or 300%. So you can imagine the mania felt by a lot of people that own homes as the value of their homes increased 100, 200, or 300%. We can see different examples of speculative bubbles historically, and I'll show you some examples here in a moment. But what it means to speculate is to sort of guess, right? To think about something and make a guess about it. You're forming an opinion based on what you think the future will be. So if you think that the value of something is going to increase, then you probably are willing to spend money on it or to invest in it, and thus anticipate or speculate a return. And sometimes when we have speculation occur, that speculation is correct, and sometimes it's incorrect. But this exists in all different markets around the world for various assets. So I want to look at a couple more characteristics of speculative bubbles. All right, here we go. So number one, values are highly inflationary. They are well beyond what we typically see for that particular asset. When the asset, quote unquote, pops, metaphorically speaking, then we see major price corrections. This is the downside of the speculative bubble, of course. And certainly if you were one of the people that speculated real estate prices would continue to rise at a rate of 82% or in some regions 200%, well then you are left holding the bag after you purchased these assets at a very, very high price. One of the first classic examples of a speculative bubble was what was known as tulip mania in Europe, Western Europe, from 1634 to 1637. It was one of the first ever speculative bubbles. And they became so popular and so highly inflationary that the story goes that an individual actually traded his home for a tulip bulb. Well, tulip mania, like every other mania and every other speculative bubble, came to a screeching halt, and of course the value of tulips fell tremendously in Europe. The dot-com bubble is another good example, and this one happened here in the United States from around 1997 to 2000. It was during this time that we had a lot of different upstart companies based on the internet and the boom of the internet that caused investors to speculate that they may be the next Google. And during the dot-com bubble, people were willing to put millions of dollars into upstart companies that hadn't shown any kind of profit, but it was with speculation that these companies would do well and potentially become the next billion-dollar company. One classic example was a company called pets.com. And so this was one of those companies that really didn't show a profit, but it was an online pet supply store, and it actually had a multi-million dollar Super Bowl commercial and had a balloon during the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. I want to show you a commercial from this, and you can see what I'm talking about. All right, so this is from the pets.com Super Bowl commercial.
Okay, Dino, I gotta go to a lot of stores to get what you like. I'll be back. If you leave me now, you'll take away the biggest part of me. Ooh, no, baby, please don't go. Ooh, girl, I just want you to stay. Hey, man, I'm getting car sick. I think I'm gonna boot.
That was it, pets.com, and people were putting lots of money behind that product. But nonetheless, that is, of course, one of the examples of the dot-com era and some of the companies that collapsed. Of course, the real estate bubble we talked about from the late 1990s, early 2000s to around 2005, another example of a speculative bubble. Okay, so the next bubble that I wanted to talk about was the mid 1980 to early 1990s bubble, which I actually grew up and actually was affected by. And this bubble was in the market for comic books. I've shared with you guys before that during my youth, I really enjoyed comic books. It was something I really enjoyed collecting. It was something that became a part of my life when I was younger. And I can remember the craze for comic books and the overall mania in the market when people assumed that comic books were just this great place to put your money and this investment tool that you could net a huge return on in the future. So the comic book bubble was another example of this. And so I've got a video clip I want to show you on this guy here. This is Todd McFarlane, and he was famous for innovations in the Spider-Man comic book. He also developed and created this comic book called Spawn. So he today now is in charge of and owns a multi-million-dollar company that makes collectibles, toy collectibles. But nonetheless, Todd McFarlane created and added and benefited from this mania by becoming a very, very wealthy person. Nonetheless, the comic book bubble draws a lot of parallels to some of the existing bubbles that we've seen in our market and ones over history. So let me show you a video clip during the 1990s that'll reflect this.
Part of me just couldn't believe it. Like, this guy is this great, and he wants to come here? Of course.
Spider-Man, when I took over Spider-Man, I thought he was in the doldrums. He was wearing a 60s hairdo, 60s clothes, 60s car. I mean, his girlfriend, his wife at that time, Mary Jane, you know, she was a model, a New York model, but she wore clothes that looked like came from Kmart, and she didn't have, I guess, a curling iron or a blow dryer because her hair was completely limp and straight. I mean, it was, what are you talking about here? So I'm going to make her look like a glamour model, which is what she was, and I'm going to dress the guy up like a current-day 22-year-old photographer in New York City, right?
Marvel books this breath of fresh air as an artist. His work had this insane energy to it. And this was an aberration.
He changed the webbing. He added a lot more webs to the costume. He made the eyes a lot bigger to give it that more of a bug-eyed look. And just a lot more creepier look.
His basic drawing was nonsensical at times. I mean, he draws characters who have no bones. But it's exciting to look at, and it's expressive.
I was getting antsy that I wanted again to write my own books. I was penciling and I was inking, and I want to write. I'm a very curious kid, and I wanted to see if I can do it.
Todd got to get his own Spider-Man title.
McFarlane's first issue sold over 3 million copies, which he says pays the bills. But his true love is baseball.
Yeah, I'm an athlete first, and then I do comic books as a living.
And so you'd go from this normal existence to this comic book existence at a comic book convention where people would scream and, crowd around him and line up for literally hours and hours and hours to get a signature, and talk about surreal.
The more profits soared, the more the sales went up, the more experimental we got. We just kept trying things.
By the end of the 80s, you had comic book fans who were interested in comics as an investment.
I just think we took advantage of them, It's the one thing that I just keep slamming my head against the wall. Just because you can take money, it doesn't... That you're going to have a better reason than to take money just because you can. Okay, here we are. We're Curious Comics here. This is... we got... What do you got? You got DC... And then, what about Image Comics other than those terrific Spawn comic books?
Well, of course, Spawn is the best-selling Image comic.
Oh, yeah, thanks for saying that.
Yeah.
Spawn in 1993 was selling somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million copies. Okay? It now sells 70,000 copies. That's how dramatic the drop has been in the comic book market.
Hey, I'll have to sign some of those Spawn books. You can get rid of them. Spider-Man, you would think.
It is becoming an increasingly antiquated art form. And I believe that it will survive in a much smaller venue. I think in the early 1990s, the industry convinced itself it was rock and roll, stadium rock and roll. Really, it's more like club jazz.
All right, so you can see that during the bubble, there was a tremendous mania for comic books, and by the early 1990s, that had sort of died out. I can actually remember when this happened. For me, I was in 1992. 1993 was when I was in high school. By then, I just stopped caring about comics as much. And so, not only that, there were people that would, during the height of the boom, they would go and they would buy because they thought that a lot of comics were worth something. For instance, on the screen, Spider-Man #1, done by Todd McFarlane, people anticipated, speculated that this would be worth a lot of money, so they would buy 5 or 6 copies. Well, you think about, multiple people buying multiple amounts of comic books, that's going to drive the value up exponentially, and that's what it did. And of course, the upswing that happened during the 80s and 90s came crashing down. All right, there are a couple of current bubbles that we can look at. Some people say the student loan industry has created a bubble. And you can see this picture right here, the bubble, right, with the graduation cap on it. The editorial cartoon here with the student that's got this debt on his shoulders. We know that today our economy offers very, very low interest rates on borrowed money to go to school, student loans. What's happened as a result is there's a lot of people that previously could not attain an education that now have access to low interest rate loans that can now go to school. The upside of this is that, we have a lot of people that are getting their degrees and getting an education and furthering their human capital. The downside is that it's creating a surplus in the market of people that have college degrees and have college educations. On top of the fact that people are graduating with mountains of debt. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases. So, nonetheless, these are all examples of bubbles that either existed or exist, and they all sort of follow the same pattern of behavior. All right, so we can see it here. This is a general way of looking at it. The original phase where the asset starts to be sold, people start to become aware of this asset. This asset gains media attention, enthusiasm. People begin to see it speculatively as a place they can make a lot of money. Other members jump in the market because they think they're missing out and they might actually have a chance to make money on this thing too. We all, at some point, think that this valuation has created a new paradigm. For instance, the 82% increase in real estate in the United States. So, okay, that's the new normal, right? Then we have the crash that begins, and people are in denial. They think, oh, well, it's going to go back to normal. Then you really see the return to normal here. And during this time period, people start to get scared because the assets they own now have a tremendous lower value. Of course, the feeling of despair during this bottoming out point, which I'm sure lots of people felt during the different bubble busts that we've seen. And then finally, maybe a return to what it was originally. All right, here's a couple of more examples, some graphs. This is the tulip bulb bubble. So you can see during the 1600s, leading up to the boom, and then of course the bust. Here's the dot-com bubble, the big boom in the industry, and then the subsequent bust. Here's the education bubble. So you can see this is the consumer price index since 1990 for various costs of things. We have general price level increases, represented by the yellow bar. We have energy prices, which are certainly more volatile. You would expect that on the blue bar. We have healthcare costs in the orange bar. And then we have education costs, tuition and fees in the green bar. And what you notice about that is growing and creating a widening gap since the early 2000s. And that's